It started with dogs. Not just any dogs, though. Brutus, Echo, and Delta were more than companions. They were retired military service animals, trained in search and rescue, crowd control, and perimeter defense. To Elaine and Thomas Braddock, they were family and lifelines. After Thomas's discharge from the military, the couple had moved to what they thought would be their last home, a quiet, spacious farm just outside a suburban neighborhood in northern Georgia. It was land they had inherited from Thomas's grandfather, rich in family history and big enough for the dogs to roam freely, a place to heal from war and rebuild life. At first, the Homeowners Association, HOA, didn't pay them much mind. Their property sat on the edge of the neighborhood, with fences that clearly marked the line between community jurisdiction and private land. But then Brutus barked at the wrong person. A child had wandered too close to the Braddocks' property while chasing a drone, and the deep, thunderous bark of the Belgian Malinois startled the boy and his mother. No one was hurt, no one was bitten, but the mother, flustered and ruffled, was Karen Winthrop, the president of the HOA. That's when the complaints began. The first letter was polite enough. A standard issue form warning of an unregistered dangerous animal on the premises, citing concerns raised by local residents. The Braddocks responded calmly, explaining that the dogs were service animals with federal registration, trained beyond the standards of domestic obedience. They offered to share documentation and even invited the HOA committee to visit and see the dogs in action. Karen declined the offer. Instead, more letters came. The tone shifted quickly. Violation of quiet hours. Intimidating presence of animals. Failure to comply with community safety ordinances. The Braddocks were bewildered. They weren't part of the HOA. Their land wasn't under the covenant agreements that governed the suburban enclave next door. Still, the citations continued. When they refused to pay the accumulating fines, legal notices followed. They were being sued by the HOA, not for damages, but for public endangerment. It would have been laughable if it hadn't escalated so fast. Drones began appearing overhead, not the kind kids fly for fun, but industrial ones with high-range lenses and night vision capabilities. The Braddocks caught them hovering above their barn late at night. They shot one down and recovered a camera card. On it were hours of footage, including close-ups of Thomas, Elaine, and the dogs. When they reported it to local authorities, they were told the HOA had a right to document code violations, even on private land, if community safety was in question. That's when the family knew something darker was at play. Thomas called in a favor from his old unit, just a routine background check on Karen Winthrop and the HOA board. What came back raised more questions than it answered. Karen wasn't just a neighborhood busybody. She had ties to a shell company based out of Nevada, one that held contracts with private security firms. There were unusual zoning permits tied to the neighborhood, grants and waivers that didn't line up with normal residential development. It all smelled off. Then came the raid. It happened just after dusk on a Thursday. 5 black SUVs with no plates pulled up at the Braddocks' front gate. Men in black tactical gear poured out, marked not with any official law enforcement badges, but with generic compliance officer patches. They carried zip ties, flashlights, and, disturbingly, shotguns loaded with beanbags. Elaine, who had been in the barn with Echo at the time, was tackled and restrained. Thomas, trying to reach her, was cuffed and thrown to the ground. The dogs? Muzzled, tranquilized, and taken by animal control. The officers claimed they had a warrant, though no copy was ever shown. They searched the house, the barn, even the underground storm shelter that Thomas's grandfather had built during the Cold War. Nothing illegal was found. The justification? Suspected code violations, potential hoarding of controlled substances, and unregistered animals posing threats to community peace. It was, Elaine later realized, not a raid, it was intimidation. In the aftermath, the Braddocks were bruised, terrified, and furious. They lawyered up. It cost them nearly $12,000 just to file a federal injunction to have the dogs returned. In the meantime, they were bombarded by anonymous calls, strange vehicles parked outside at night, and even found one of their fence posts cut clean through. The message was clear, get out, but they didn't. Instead, Elaine started documenting everything. She installed cameras, hidden ones this time, and started a private online journal, logging every violation, every vehicle, every voice she could capture. What she uncovered stunned her. There was activity beneath the neighborhood. At first, it was just strange power spikes on her grid, coming from the area directly behind the HOA clubhouse. Then came the sounds, low, metallic grinding at night, faint whirring beneath the earth. Thomas found schematics in a forgotten filing cabinet that had belonged to his grandfather. The plans revealed an unused drainage tunnel connecting the old farm to what was now the subdivision. It had been sealed decades ago. Or so they thought. The Braddocks entered the tunnel one night with flashlights and cameras. What they found stunned them into silence. A large steel door, welded shut, bore a faint but unmistakable symbol, the International Hazard Mark for chemical storage. Nearby were crates, old, rusted, but stenciled with U.S. Army surplus numbers. Whatever was behind that door had been buried, and forgotten, long before the homes were built above it. Or maybe not forgotten at all. Maybe hidden. Elaine's footage was shaky but damning. She uploaded a short clip, just 15 seconds, of the tunnel and crates to a private veterans network. Within 24 hours, she received a message from an anonymous account with one line. That site is not supposed to exist. That was the turning point. The Braddocks knew they had stumbled onto something far bigger than a neighborhood feud. This wasn't about dogs or noise ordinances. It was a cover-up. The HOA, or at least its leadership, was protecting something toxic, and they were willing to go to extreme lengths to keep it buried. When Thomas's former squadmate, Jesse, Trixie, Morales, a now retired military chemist, flew in to inspect the footage and run soil samples, her face went pale. This, she whispered, is Cold War stockpile grade. And if it's still active, it's a federal crime. They needed evidence, real, irrefutable evidence. In the weeks that followed, they set up a sting of sorts. Trixie, posing as a corporate environmental assessor, requested access to the HOA property under the guise of a routine compliance audit. Karen refused, violently in fact. A day later, the Braddock's barn burned to the ground. The fire department's report listed it as accidental. Elaine's cameras told a different story. A shadowed figure tossing accelerant through a side window, then fleeing toward the neighborhood with a walkie-talkie in hand. That footage went viral within hours of Elaine sharing it on her newly created TikTok account, tagged simply #HOA Terror. National news picked it up. Then came the lawyers. Then came the feds. The fire was the match that ignited the powder keg. Within 72 hours, a swarm of federal agents descended on the suburban neighborhood once tightly controlled by Karen Winthrop's iron grip. Men in suits with Department of Justice credentials, EPA inspectors in hazmat gear, and even a forensic accountant from the Treasury Department arrived, each drawn by the sudden explosion of online evidence and the viral spread of the #HOA Terror hashtag. It was no longer a local matter. It was national. Karen, for all her iron-lipped decorum and pearly neighborhood smiles, went into hiding. She hadn't counted on the Braddocks being so persistent, or so connected. In her eyes, they were supposed to be the quiet, reclusive military couple living on old land no one cared about. She had miscalculated. Terribly. Federal agents uncovered what the Braddocks had only begun to suspect. Beneath the immaculate lawns and cul-de-sacs of the Pleasant Hills community was a sprawling Cold War era chemical storage facility, an off-the-books depository that had been quietly inherited by a now-defunct defense subcontractor. Over the decades, as properties were developed, zoning records had been altered, destroyed, or buried under bureaucratic red tape. What remained was an unstable cocktail of forgotten chemical agents sealed underground, sitting less than 100 feet beneath hundreds of families. Karen had known. Not only had she known, but she had actively worked to keep it hidden. Her connections to the Nevada-based Shell Corporation were more than incidental. That company, as it turned out, owned a minority stake in a private zoning management firm that quietly advised suburban HOAs across the southeast. Karen had used that influence to file fraudulent zoning waivers, secure hush permits, and quietly suppress soil integrity tests. She was being paid to protect the secret. And she used every tool available, including legal harassment, fabricated safety violations, and violent intimidation, to remove threats to that secret. The Braddocks and their dogs had simply been too close to the truth. The dogs were eventually returned to the family by court order. Brutus, though slower now, barked like a storm cloud when he saw Elaine again. Echo whimpered and collapsed into Thomas's arms, and Delta, who had suffered a minor leg injury during the raid, limped but leaned in with the full weight of loyalty. Elaine took each of their collars in her hands and whispered, "They didn't break us." A public hearing was ordered. Karen, now charged with multiple counts including fraud, conspiracy, environmental endangerment, and abuse of authority, stood before a packed federal courtroom with no allies left to lean on. The most damning evidence wasn't even the soil tests or the zoning violations. It was Elaine's footage. The drone shots. The barn fire. The intercepted emails. And perhaps most powerfully, the testimonies. Dozens of neighbors, once passive, some even hostile, now came forward. They spoke of being silenced, of ignored concerns, of being pressured to fall in line. One mother choked back tears as she revealed her child's unexplained respiratory illnesses, always worse at home, near the clubhouse. Another man admitted to helping Karen install the surveillance system, thinking it was for neighborhood safety, only to realize it was part of a larger campaign of targeted harassment. The most dramatic moment came when Trixie Morales took the stand. Her credentials, PhD, former Army chemist, veteran of foreign deployment labs, made her an unimpeachable witness. She confirmed under oath that the materials stored under Pleasant Hills included decaying canisters of VX nerve agent, lewisite, and other legacy toxins outlawed under international convention. The storage facility wasn't just a regulatory violation. It was a ticking time bomb. Karen broke down on the third day of the trial, her composure finally cracking. Her defense team pleaded for leniency, blaming mismanagement, lack of clear federal guidelines, and even misplaced trust in outdated records. The jury wasn't moved. Within hours, Karen was found guilty on all charges. She was sentenced to 25 years in federal prison without the possibility of early release. The HOA was dissolved by court order. All assets were frozen. The subdivision was declared a temporary federal environmental remediation zone, and many residents, some reluctantly, others gladly, accepted government relocation assistance. The land would be cleaned, the underground facility decommissioned, and what remained would eventually return to green space, a quiet but haunted field. As for the Braddocks, they were offered compensation, public apologies, and book deals. They accepted none of it, at least not at first. "This isn't a story," Thomas told a local reporter. "It was our life. And it nearly killed us." But slowly, piece by piece, they began to rebuild. The dogs were officially recognized in a private ceremony at Fort Benning, Georgia. Representatives from the Department of Defense, along with members of Thomas's former unit, gathered to bestow the animals with honors reserved for retiring service members. Brutus, Echo, and Delta each received custom military vests, bronze plaques, and most meaningfully, veteran status recognition under the newly adopted Service Animal Transition Act. It was the first time the act had been invoked for animals defending a civilian family. Elaine wept when the flag was folded and presented to her, not for a funeral, but for survival. Word spread. Not just about the chemical cover-up or the trial, but about the dogs. About the Braddocks fight. About the power of persistence, of courage. Veterans groups across the country picked up the story. Animal rights advocates lobbied for better legal protections for service animals. Lawmakers quietly introduced reforms targeting HOA oversight, and at least 3 states began investigating similar allegations of neighborhood corruption and zoning fraud. The internet buzzed, not with memes or gossip this time, but with solidarity. Hashtag HOA Terror became hashtag Dogs of Defense. Videos of Brutus standing watch on the front porch were shared with millions. Messages poured in from as far away as Alaska and Maine, people thanking the Braddocks for standing their ground, for not folding under pressure, for reminding the country what dignity under threat looks like. Still, life wasn't easy. Elaine struggled with anxiety, often waking at 3 a.m. in cold sweats. The sound of helicopters still triggered Thomas, and they both bore the invisible scars of constant vigilance. But the land, now cleared, quiet, and no longer under scrutiny, offered peace. In spring, they planted a new orchard where the barn once stood. Peach trees mostly. Brutus liked to nap under them. One day, while raking the soil, Thomas paused, feeling the weight of it in his hands. "Funny," he said to Elaine. "All that darkness buried down there, and still something good can grow." Elaine nodded. "Because we didn't let them on the ground." And that's how the healing began, not with parades or politics, but with roots and furrows, sweat and sun, and dogs sprawled in the shade. But even as normalcy returned, one truth remained: they would never let their guard down again. The seasons rolled forward, as they always do. Time doesn't pause for pain, nor does it ask permission to move on. Yet for the Braddock family, time had split itself into two: before the fire and after. Before the raid and after. Before Karen and after. Everything that came before felt like a dream, warm, distant, peaceful. Everything after was measured in vigilance. The land looked the same, mostly, but it felt different, as if it, too, was recovering from something invisible. The old peach orchard, newly replanted, was just beginning to show green tips of life again. Brutus, the oldest of their dogs, had claimed the shade beneath one of the young trees as his preferred nap spot. His eyes were still sharp, though his pace had slowed. He no longer bolted across the field like a rocket, but he didn't need to. He had already earned his place. Elaine would watch him sometimes from the porch, camera resting in her lap, coffee warm in hand, heart heavy with memory. Echo sat beside her, still as a statue, tail lightly sweeping the wooden floor. The peace was real, but it was the kind of peace that comes after a battle, earned, fragile, and full of ghosts. There were new routines now. Morning perimeter checks, not just with the dogs, but with handheld monitors and surveillance feeds. Thomas had rigged up an off-grid drone defense system, courtesy of a few old friends from his army tech unit. He never bragged about it, but Elaine could see the satisfaction in his face when the system pinged and swept the airspace with quiet efficiency. This was their home, and no one would violate it again. The day the letter arrived, it was a Saturday.no return address. No note. Just a single photograph printed on glossy stock, an aerial shot of the Braddock farm. The image was recent, within the last few days. It showed their house, the orchard, and what looked like infrared markers near the barn's foundation. Whoever took it had sophisticated equipment. Elaine stared at the photo for a long time before sliding it across the kitchen table. "You think it's a warning?" she asked. Thomas looked at it, then at her. "No. It's a message." "What kind?" "The kind that says they're still watching." They didn't panic. They didn't argue. They didn't call the police. They already knew how useless that was. Instead, they got to work. A new layer of perimeter defense went up within a week. Additional cameras were hidden in tree trunks, along fences, inside utility boxes. The motion detectors were replaced with multi-spectrum sensors capable of detecting body heat at long range. The property's electrical system was fortified with solar backups and battery reserves. And Thomas, silently, began reactivating the protocols he hadn't used since active duty. They had been caught off guard once. Never again. But even as they prepared, they refused to live like fugitives. That was the challenge they faced every day, balancing caution with peace, self-defense with freedom. Elaine refused to give up her walks through the orchard. Thomas still went into town for supplies, and sat in the same seat at the local diner every Thursday. And the dogs, they were given back their freedom to roam, to run, to patrol, to nap in the sun. Their instincts would keep them alert, but Elaine was determined not to let fear define their new life. That fall, Elaine received an invitation to speak at a national symposium in Washington, D.C., a joint event hosted by a bipartisan coalition of lawmakers, veterans organizations, and legal reform advocates. The topic: homeowners associations and the abuse of local authority. Elaine nearly declined. Public speaking wasn't her thing. Her voice trembled at PTA meetings. But this wasn't about her comfort anymore. Trixie flew in the week before to help her prepare. They stayed up late over strong coffee and old memories, rehearsing stories, refining her message. Elaine didn't want to sound angry, or broken, or bitter. She wanted to sound clear, focused, strong. "You're not there to vent," Trixie told her. "You're there to plant a flag." And so she did. On a crisp October morning, Elaine Braddock stood on a stage before 600 people, politicians, activists, lawyers, veterans, and journalists, and told them the story. She didn't dramatize it. She didn't need to. The truth was dramatic enough. She told them about the letters, the drones, the raid, the fire, the dogs being taken, the night they found the underground chemical storage site, the cover-up, the lies, the threats. She told them how easy it had been for power to disguise itself as community leadership, and how easily a smiling neighbor could become an enforcer of fear. She didn't end her speech with a triumph. She ended with a warning. "This wasn't a glitch in the system," she said, voice steady. "It was the system, working exactly the way certain people designed it to work. It didn't fail us. It targeted us. And if it targeted us, it can target others." There was silence. Then applause. Then standing ovation. But Elaine barely heard it. She was staring into the faces of strangers who had come to listen, some nodding, some weeping, others staring with cold resolve. Afterward, she was approached by people from all over the country. A woman from New Mexico who lost her home after fighting her HOA over native plants in her front yard. A disabled veteran from Tennessee whose emotional support dog had been seized under noise complaints. A father from Oregon whose child developed chronic illness from unreported industrial waste buried under a neighborhood park. Their stories were different, but the pattern was the same: authority wielded without conscience. Process turned into punishment. Safety used as a shield for suppression. Elaine stayed in touch with many of them. Quiet emails. Signal calls. Shared documents. They began forming something of an informal alliance. People who had been pushed, threatened, fined, or sued into silence. People who had resisted. They called themselves the Watchline. It wasn't an organization. No membership cards, no newsletter. Just a shared purpose: to protect those who couldn't protect themselves, and to keep watch on the places where darkness liked to hide under. Normal. The Braddocks didn't seek out fame. They weren't looking for awards or platforms. But their story began to spread organically, first through veteran networks, then local news, and eventually major documentaries. Elaine declined every book deal, but she did approve a short film directed by a young journalist who had covered the trial. The film went viral. Dogs of Defense, it was called. It told the story not just of surveillance and resistance, but of the bond between the Braddocks and their animals. Brutus became something of an icon. His face, stoic, alert, noble, was printed on shirts, flags, patches, and murals in small towns across the South. A children's book about service animals in retirement featured his likeness. Echo and Delta were awarded civilian commendations from the Department of Defense. Their collars were preserved in the National K9 Hall of Valor exhibit in Virginia. But at home, they were still just dogs. One rainy evening, Thomas sat by the fire, rubbing Delta's ears, as Elaine flipped through old photographs. The one of the barn, taken the day before the fire, made her pause. In the background, just visible through the window, was the faint silhouette of a person, something they hadn't noticed before. "Did you ever figure out who it was?" she asked. Thomas shook his head. "Doesn't matter now. What matters is they lost." Elaine turned the photo over. On the back, she had written a quote months ago, but forgotten it. "They tried to erase us. Instead, they made us visible." Years passed, and the orchard grew strong. The house, once charred and vulnerable, now stood reinforced and quiet. The scars didn't disappear, but they softened. Elaine started teaching photography workshops to local kids. Thomas volunteered with veteran outreach programs. And Brutus, finally, began to sleep through the night. One summer morning, a family arrived at their gate, a woman and her teenage son, their car weighed down with camping gear, and a dog in the back seat. They had driven from Kentucky. The woman, trembling, explained that she had been forced out of her neighborhood after her PTSD support dog triggered a dispute with her HOA. Her voice cracked when she said she had nowhere left to go. Thomas looked at her, then at the boy, then at the dog. He opened the gate. "You've got a place here," he said. They weren't a shelter. They weren't a charity. But the Braddocks knew that part of survival was making space for others to stand beside you. Over time, more came. Some stayed for days, others for weeks. They helped on the farm, shared meals, fixed fences, watched the skies. And each left with something more than safety. They left with the knowledge that justice, real, grounded, stubborn justice, was still alive. One evening, as the sun bled across the sky in streaks of gold and crimson, Elaine sat with a journal in her lap and began to write again. Not just what had happened, but what could come next. Justice doesn't end with convictions. It begins with memory, with vigilance, with truth. It begins when someone chooses not to look away. And so, the Braddocks chose every day not to look away. One night, during a soft Georgia thunderstorm, Thomas wrote one last note in his old field journal, the one he had used during the chaos and after. "They came with fear. We answered with truth. They brought fire. We survived the ashes. They tried to take our dogs. But they didn't understand. They were never just dogs. They were guardians. And so were we, and we still are." There was no neat ending, no cinematic fade-out. Life continued, complex and uncertain. But on that patch of land in northern Georgia, under peach trees that had grown taller than memory, stood a home. Not because it was built, but because it was defended. And in that quiet place, surrounded by loyal dogs, strong fences, and strong hearts, a family remained ready for whatever would come next.